Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. After starting to look at this genre over a year ago, it's time to bring some closure by looking at what is considered by many to be the best of the bunch, Descent 3. Looking back at the development of this game, it's rather impressive that it was able to earn that recognition. The original developer, namely Parallax, had just split into two different studios, Volition, who would focus on more traditional space shooters, and Outrage, who continued to carry the torch for the Descent franchise and then do little else of note until most of the team ended up back at Volition. Excellent foresight there, guys. And yet, not only was some of the original team working on a different project, there was a lot of ambition put behind this one. Pretty much everything that you could improve on, they tried to, and for many, it ended up being for the better. However, I have my own little history with this game, as this is the one that introduced me to the series. Unfortunately, it was not a pleasant introduction, as at the time, I was still a little kid who thought he was in for something like Free Space 2 or X-Wing. Naturally, that meant I got stuck at level 2 to a degree where that level's music is still burned in my memory, and swiftly moved on to something else out of frustration. Now that I've played the predecessors and have a better appreciation for the genre as a whole, perhaps things will be different. So, are the improvements enough to win me over despite my unflattering first impression? Let's find out. Ordinarily for old school shooters, the story is fairly threadbare and not worth mentioning, but this is not one of those cases. As part of their effort to try and improve everything, you're not just a random sarcastic guy working for a big corporation by blowing stuff up. Now you're blowing stuff up and doing other miscellaneous things for a small group of scientists because the big corporation you worked for incited a supposed accident that was meant to kill you. Now, in order for your main character to get paid for his efforts in the first two games, he has to help this group of scientists expose the big bad corporation for the manipulative jerks that they are, while said corporation starts breathing down your neck in response. I intentionally didn't use any names in that description because the only reason that I remember the name of the big bad corporation is because of the other two games. I literally can't remember the other names because the plot really doesn't do much outside of giving us a reason to go through the gameplay. There's just nothing memorable about them. Admittedly, they do throw a nice curveball towards the middle, but the circumstances weren't terribly interesting, nor were they something that I really wanted to learn more about. Part of the reason for that, however, is due to the presentation. For the most part, the information you're getting is either through comm channels and various panels in-game, or from mission briefings and the occasional cutscene. Because of that, we don't get to see a lot of character interaction, and said characters really don't end up progressing anywhere of note. They do provide a fair amount of context, but because it's mostly read out, we don't get to see too much of what occurs. And honestly, even when we do get to the cutscenes, the voice acting and animation destroys any immersion we might have had. It's not quite Resident Evil 1 bad, but it does come really close, which means if the goal is to create a serious story, then your plan just backfired. Massively. The animations, however, are what really kills the cutscenes for me. Not because the graphics themselves are terrible, but because the characters move like robots more than the actual robots. I know that the focus of the game was on the robots since that we interact with them more often, and when push comes to shove the gameplay gets a higher priority, but when you get to the cutscenes, it goes into Uncanny Valley territory really quickly, and never really leaves it. Honestly, I might not mind so much if their mouths weren't so off-putting. Ugh, that's the one part of animation that really rubs me the wrong way when it's off, and it's really obnoxious when looking at the cutscenes. Fortunately, while it might be a good attempt given the genre but not all that interesting, we're not here for a gripping story, and that's not why I played the game. Because of that, the story and cutscenes won't factor in too much, so let's look at the presentation within the game instead. When it doesn't involve the human characters, the graphics don't look bad. I've mentioned in past reviews that when you're using early 3D graphics, robots are really where you can get away with the most, and that seems to still be the case here. They're definitely more detailed than the previous two games, but because they're robots, I don't care if the animation on them is stiff because that's what you'd expect. Something I'll be repeating throughout this review is that there is a lot of variety, and the different settings in robots are no exception. Since we're not just dealing with mining robots turned hostile, we get to see different types of robots that were used for different purposes, ranging from security enforcers to ground-based vehicles to whatever those obnoxious, impossible-to-hit minnow-looking things were. Since then we're not just exploring through the interior of a mine, we get to see more variety in the setting, and actually travel outside of whatever building we're investigating. We primarily focus on research facilities, but my favorite level was a lot of fun in part because it took place in a city where there were, as you would expect, security robots everywhere, with plenty of frantic action to back it up. The sound quality is also really good, as each weapon and robot sound distinct enough to where I know what I'm dealing with without necessarily seeing said robot directly. The music isn't personally to my taste, as I tend not to enjoy the genre they used, but it still fits the circumstances well, and there is a lot of it, so kudos to the composer on that account. The real king of variety, however, is the gameplay itself, as they tried to add in a lot without changing the underlying concept. Since much of this depends on the weapon variety, as that dictates the limits of the robots and levels, let's start there. When I started to play this, the main thing I noticed is that the laser levels were gone. There were only lasers and super lasers to worry about. Part of me was concerned about that, especially given the weapons they had introduced early on, but then I really got to see the selection. Perhaps the main thing is that they've added more weapons that rely on different ammo types. The Faust cannon acts like the old Vulcan by instantly hitting the target, with the main difference being that the knockback on enemies is actually kind of ridiculous. I found myself not using it all that often purely because of that knockback, but if I were being more sensible or a better shot, I probably could have used it on some of the more annoying melee robots to get some distance. It seems like a weapon designed for long-ranged attacks against turrets and for knocking opponents away, as we don't have to worry about travel time and the actual hits don't hurt all that much. The really fun weapons though are the Mass Driver and Napalm. I didn't find myself using the Napalm all that often, as when you play with fire you tend to set yourself and your guidebot on fire too. It's basically a new Phoenix Cannon for me. A weapon I might not use a whole lot, but when I use it, I love it. And honestly, it's probably for the best that the Phoenix Cannon isn't in the game, if only for the sake of idiots like me. Huh, what is that? Phoenix Cannon?
Oh, the Phoenix! Yeah, by the way, the projectiles bounce off walls, so be careful.
I noticed! Oh man, I could get such awesome trick shots if I were actually good at this game. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. That is awesome. I like this gun. What?!
Wow.
That didn't happen. That didn't happen. The Mass Driver, on the other hand, was one I didn't understand at first until I really looked at it. It's effectively a heavy-fire sniper rifle that can one-shot most small robots. It was a little awkward to fire while I was figuring it out, especially if the enemy closes in on you, but the recoil and sound effect when you do fire it are awesome. This was even more the case because the ammo for the weapon wasn't all that common, meaning for the times when I was in an open area and wanted to fire it, I had to be sure I knew what I was aiming at. But given the open environments and the large rooms you can find yourself in, it works surprisingly well. I didn't use too much of the other energy weapons, as I found they either drained too much of my reserves or were only useful for specific circumstances. But I think the real problem is that the quad super lasers are still the most powerful and easiest to use. Especially given the heavy shift that you get later on, the super lasers were too easy to use for most circumstances to where the only time I would use other energy weapons were when I wanted to be fancy. The good news is that the missile weapons more than make up for it, as while you have your standard missiles like concussion, homing, and guided, they added a lot of cool ones that I really like. My new favorite additions are the frag missile and impact mortar, the former acting as a more powerful concussion missile that sends shrapnel everywhere, the latter traveling a short distance and then pulverizing everything near it. Outside of that, most of the other weapons are certainly effective, but are ones which I either have already talked about in previous reviews, or are worth seeing for yourself to just grasp the awesomeness of. Or to act like me and accidentally kill yourself with them, because holy crap they can hurt. When it comes to the energy using all of these weapons, I'm very thankful for the fact that the robots are reasonable regarding what they can and cannot use. There's no annoying Vulcan robot that can just take a chunk of your health before you can react. The infamous Thief bot has been toned down a lot, and I can't think of an enemy that has one of the super powerful missiles as their default attack. When you do run into boss robots, their focus is less on using powerful weapons and instead turning the game into a 3D bullet hell full of energy and missiles for you to dodge. Especially in later levels, they managed to do a lot with that idea, making bosses not only tougher and larger, but sometimes keeping them about the same size as you and just making them a lot more mobile. The city level I mentioned has a couple of mercenaries come after you, and that was the first time an enemy killed me in the game thus far that wasn't one of those stupid trains and that stupid subway, because apparently good level design means literally bashing your head into a wall, or train in this case. Ugh, my favorite level of the whole game, with a really good mini-boss, and you just had to make me get past those dumb trains to do it. However, to some degree, the trains and the bosses both feed into my biggest criticism of the game, and the reason why, for me, it isn't always compelling. There's little to no penalty for dying. Sure, you might lose some of your stockpiled missiles if they're above a certain threshold, and you have to get what you do have back, but there's no live system to encourage you to not let that happen. The final boss fight was actually one of the easiest parts of the game purely because I knew that I could run in, throw out all of the default concussion missiles they gave me, shoot a little bit at the entrance where the boss couldn't touch me, and then if I were feeling cheeky, run in for a little bit to grab something a little more powerful before I rinse and repeat. At first when I was playing, I was trying to keep from dying entirely, and if you play it like that, then there are a lot of tense moments where you don't want to lose. And yet, once you realize that nobody's counting your deaths, at least not outside of the score screen, Occam's razor kicks in and takes all of the tension with it, especially when the power of Leroy Jenkins compels thee. Because of that, I also didn't spend a lot of time with the harder difficulties because there didn't seem to be much of a point this time around. Sure, it would be harder in the moment and it might take me more time to get through an area, but that's not necessarily because I'm having to be more careful, but because the power of Leroy Jenkins wasn't quite enough this time around. I can't speak too much to how difficult or otherwise they compare relative to the starting difficulty, but for what I played, the default difficulty was about right anyway. It had its frantic moments, the robots were sufficiently durable without being bullet spongy, and there were enough of them to work well within the level design. There were some areas where a robot spawner was on for a little too long and some of the robots were extremely frustrating to deal with, but in most cases I can chalk that up to me being terrible more so than the game doing anything wrong. That being said, however, the lack of a consequence for death wasn't the only problem I had with the game, as it felt like the levels lasted just a little too long as well. I'm not even sure how to describe why, so let's talk about the level design and maybe I can explain why I feel the pacing is a bit off through that. The good news is that since there are more varied locations, the levels are allowed to be more creative in that regard. I can't necessarily tell all of the research facilities apart, but given that we visit multiple planets and different places within those planets, ranging from temples to prisons to the city level I mentioned, there is a lot to see and a lot to explore. There are, as always, plenty of secrets filled with more weapons, shield and ammo pickups, and a couple of secret levels for the observant player and guide follower alike. On the whole, the level design is pretty solid, and when things might be confusing, they've done a couple of things to make it better. First and foremost, the map is a lot easier to use this time around. Instead of using the old wireframe layout, they used colored rooms and hallways. This change is a lifesaver, as the old wireframe system had started to wear thin given how complicated and large the levels had become, and if that had remained, there would have been hell to pay. Here though, each room is clearly visible, and how they connect is relatively easy to follow, with my only complaint being that it can be difficult to pin down where your ship is when you look at the map from further away. The second thing they've done is to make the guide bot a little more useful. Instead of just looking for 3 keys and then going for a reactor, this time we have more and varied objectives to reach throughout, and if we need to find our way forward, the guide bot is always there if we need it. This time it's something we can choose to deploy, meaning that if you get annoyed when it shoots flares into your backside or its pathing goes haywire, you can put it in timeout or shoot it back. And yes, your guide bot can get damaged, and if it gets damaged enough, you'll need to spend shields to get it back, so you might want to keep this guy in your hull if you're fighting enemy robots. Except when you're dealing with fire, because apparently the guide bot has the extinguisher, because why would they give you something as useful as that? Either way, I have noticed that the guide bot tends to get stuck more than it used to, but given how the levels are more organic and the fact that you can get the guide bot out of that predicament by sending him back to your ship, there are ways around the problem. So now that I've waxed lyrical about those 2 points, let's get back to my main criticism of the level design, that of the pacing being just a little too slow for my liking. I think the reason for saying that is twofold. First off, the issue of death being largely irrelevant means that any issue we run across isn't an opportunity to get better and try again, but rather a time for us to go through a chunk of the level just to get back to where we're supposed to be. The main reason though is because of the way objectives are handled. This might sound odd, but I actually wish they had stuck to something simpler like the colored key system. That system is certainly basic, and for the story they told, it would have been difficult to implement, but it gives us clear indicators as we move through a level. We find a key, we access more of the level. A simple system that encourages exploration and that we see visibly represented in the UI. Because we aren't beholden to those anymore, levels can go from being interesting mazes to explore to a chore as we figure out where the next objective is, give up and just follow the guide bot after a while, and hope that it's the last one we have to deal with. There isn't a clear indicator as to when certain areas are locked or unlocked, which also means that it can be more difficult to feel the sense of accomplishment when we do gain access to an area. It might be more gimmicky to use the colored key system, but it conveys more directly the progress you're making to where, even though the levels are about the same length as Descent 2, they felt longer than they should have. Another part could be that, despite all of the improvements made, as a result of how ambitious everything was, there were more than a few rough patches where the game didn't really explain what to do or something wasn't well thought out. That meant I would spend longer than otherwise twiddling my thumbs wondering if I missed something, investigating around to hopefully find what I was looking for, only to look online and find out that, oh, actually that's what I was supposed to do, so thank you for being absolutely obtuse. Perhaps the worst case though was the search and destroy mission on level 13, where in order to progress you basically have to hunt down every last robot in the level to actually finish it. I mean, it's nice that the guidebot can target robots for me to fight, but when I technically only have to target a certain kind of robot, it feels like overkill. Especially when it taunts me by giving me the non-option of looking for the specific robots, only to have no nav data for that objective. I mean, it makes sense given they move around within the area you're in, but that turns gameplay which I otherwise would be enjoying with reckless abandon into a chore. And don't even get me started on whatever bug was in that level that caused my save file to become corrupted and crash the game. I had to replay the level twice because of that. There are other moments I can bring up, but I think I've said everything I need to. Overall, there is a lot to like within the game. I enjoyed the weapon, level, and enemy variety, and I even kind of like what attempt they made at a story, as you could tell there was some genuine effort put behind it, especially with what the resulting story allowed them to do within the gameplay. And yet there are all these little problems scattered throughout that didn't destroy the game for me, but were certainly immersion breaking. By all rights, I should be praising this game as the best 6 Degrees of Freedom game ever made, and on paper it certainly looks like it, but then you hit a rough patch where something isn't explained, or the trains run into you, or you realize that the challenge I might have reveled in really isn't there when death has so little impact. When I think about the previous Descent games, I would probably put this on par with them. As while Descent 3 added a lot, it wasn't as clean on the execution. So in the end, my recommendation comes down to this. Is the variety they have on offer enough to where you don't mind going through some rough areas to get there? For me personally, I don't regret my time with the game, but it's not something I'll be returning to anytime soon. If this would be your entry into the genre, then it's probably the best place to start. As while I hated the lack of a death penalty, that fact is something that will make it easier for you to get a feel for the genre. However, bear in mind that there is currently a legal slap fight going on between what remains of Parallax and Interplay over royalties for Descent 1 and 2. For some reason, Descent 3 also got swept up in that, which means you can't buy any of the old Descent series on either Steam or GOG. I don't condone video game piracy, but unless you can find an old CD of the game, that's sadly the only way to get it until that's resolved, which by the time of this video's release is not the case. What I can say is that the version I used was the old CD version, and while I had to go into an out-of-game menu to set up my resolution, I was able to get it to 1600 by 900. 1080p is technically possible, but it ended up cropping my screen in a weird way when I tried, so I guess we can't have nice things this time around. The only time I had issues actually playing the game were when I tried to record it, in which case it would either have no problems and give me a black screen in the recorded video, or constantly crash every time I breathed on it wrong. Either way, that's all I have for this video. Thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a not-so-regular basis. Well, this wasn't quite the end to the Descent series I was hoping for, but at least it is finally concluded, and I did get to have a decent amount of fun either way. Hopefully the other franchises I started can be wrapped up a little faster. So, to make that happen, I'm gonna go work on one of those, and we'll see you all later.